we won't have a couple of instances where, but usually it's just that education side that helps them out. Yeah.
Do the check stations actually have the ability to detect the species we're looking at?
Mm-hmm.
Even, like, they got microscopes there and
Not to that
sort of thing,
level.
but yeah.
But it becomes different when you're inspecting for the villagers, and when you're inspecting for the settlers, and when you're inspecting for the adults. The villagers are somewhat easy, even though they're in raw water, you just have to look for the water, and then make sure to get that water out and clean, drain, and dry that. The settlers, you're gonna have to feel for them, but they are trained to look for the settler stage. And the idea is therefore, if you're looking for something that small, when you see the adult and you're doing the same inspection, that becomes obvious, especially when it's this infested, which they rarely are. You're not usually going to find this on a boat. But yeah, generally when you're coming up to a villager type of situation with raw water, we just get a baler sponge in there, get some hot water in there, heat it up, and then drain out and then make sure it's dry.
So are there stations in Idaho that you can go to?
Yep.
Where
We'll go
where are they
to,
located?
I think, a map here at the end of the spiel. Yeah, we'll talk about that here in a little bit. if that's
Okay.
all right. Yeah, we have several stations throughout the state.
I want to
Sure.
do the next two slides because those are the sticker and
Oh yeah, we should just jump to this. So what year did Quag Mussels get into Lake Mead? It was 88 and then 2007. I wish I had a piece of candy. So 2007, that lit the fire. And then just right after that, we get the Hello Boat. And the story behind Hello Boat is it came out and it was driving up the Wasatch Front through Salt Lake City. And it was on the freeway. And a biologist was driving next to it. And he knew a little bit of background behind the mussels. Happened to see there was mussels on it. He said, "Where's this boat going?" So then he got on the phone and he called a bunch of his fishing game buddies, I believe, and all the states, and it was like lit the fire and everybody was looking for this boat. They ended up parking across the street from a guy up in Coeur d'Alene, and the boat had been sold and repossessed, and ended up and it was going to launch into Coeur d'Alene, and somebody across the street found it, and they said, "Hey, here's the boat you guys are looking for." And that really lit the fire behind the whole program. So the mussels in 2007, the Hello Boat, and then the very next year we have legislation being passed through in 2008 that gives Idaho the authority to inspect, decontaminate, hold, that kind of stuff. We all know that when we're talking about the invasive species sticker, that the legislation necessarily isn't very effective if you don't have a funding source, and therefore we place an invasive species sticker in there. Dedicated fund, user fee. It's bundled through Parks and Recreation. It then gets passed through Department of Agriculture as a dedicated fund in which we administer it. It funds three primary goals, and that's prevention, education, and monitoring. And you can see the fee breakdown there, where if you're an Idaho resident, it's $10, the cheapest one as far as being motorized, and that's going to be included in your registration. So most folks pay that now, and they don't necessarily even acknowledge it. $22 for the non-resident. That's primarily because they're the biggest threat. Is when we have folks come up through Utah, Nevada, they're going to be paying the most. And then a $7 non-motorized fee. The only exemption of that is an inflatable boat that is less than 10 feet. I buy one for my kayak and my boat.
And that's required.
That is required.
There's a law.
Yep.
You'll get, if someone sees that you don't have a sticker and you're out there with a canoe, just canoeing about, and you don't have a sticker, you can get fined.
It is required to launch in Idaho water bodies. So if you're traveling through the state, you're just a transit, then you're not required, which is fine. But it includes joint jurisdictional boundaries, so like Hell's Canyon, whether it's you're launching on the Idaho side, you're gonna need an Idaho sticker. If you're launching on the Oregon side, you need an Oregon sticker.
What an accomplishment getting the Idaho legislature to move on anything that quickly without.
Oh,
They were scared.
they pushed it hard, and I wasn't around during that time, so I'm not sure how that all came about. But I think we had a couple of legislators that pushed it pretty hard.
Might have been a couple Coeur d'Alene.
No, I mean, fishermen were scared. Anybody
Yeah,
who
you
uses the
can-
water system for
with your
recreation were scared.
Examples of the pipe and license plate.
Source of money was involved.
Makes the point. Wow.
All right, well, also we're looking for aquatic plants when we do the inspection stations. They definitely share a lot of the characteristics that the zebra and quagga mussels have. They outcompete the native species, they reduce biodiversity, they impede recreation. They definitely change the environment that we're used to and utilize. They increase the nutrient loads in river water systems. Let's see, things for cost, like it inhibits irrigation, it can cause problems for hydroelectric dams, it can cause flooding, definitely creating stagnant water that could make nice mosquito habitat. We all know how much we love mosquitoes. And it can be economically devastating, so we're also looking for these plants, these aquatic invasives at the check stations. Some of the main ones of concern are Eurasian water milfoil, also dealing with flowering rush. I have the misfortunate pleasure of dealing with hydrilla. That's the plant that I use, or that I work mostly on during the summer. Yellow floating heart and water hyacinth, and these are just a few of them. We have a whole list of invasive and noxious plants that cause problems. So you guys may find this one familiar, Eurasian water milfoil. Anyone guess where it's from? So we have populations in northern Idaho, eastern Idaho and western Idaho and central. There is a population in Payette Lake. Have any of you seen milfoil? So this plant, it was first discovered in 1940, and it's become very widespread. I'll show you a distribution map in a minute. It was either introduced through ballast water tanks, kind of the same as the zebra and quagga mussels, or it was brought in with the aquarium trade. They don't really know, but it got out and it spread fast. It's a submersed plant. You can find it at depths of 1 to 15 feet, but depending on the light availability in a clear water system, it can be as deep as 30 feet down. Once in the system, it's going to reproduce primarily by fragmentation, and it's a very delicate, brittle plant. So boat motors, propellers chop that thing up, and they just kind of drift and float to a new spot. There are native milfoils that look very similar to this. Nope, next slide. So you can see with these pictures, when this plant comes in, it tops out, and it's going to decrease the amount of light that other native plants can use. It's also going to create a stagnant condition. That water is not going to be moving freely. It can heat up the water. They have an ability, and most of these plants have the ability to suck up nitrogen and phosphorus from the soil that usually plants can't use, or they don't use in as high numbers. And when these plants die off, then those go back into the system, the nutrient loading. And you can see in the bottom lower right that when all that biomass dies, it just kind of piles up on the shoreline, and you see nice little bugs flying around, and the stink is pretty nasty. So this is definitely one that will affect property values. Nobody really wants to go outside on their beach and smell that. They can also reproduce by seeds, and that ability has allowed them to cross with native milfoil species. And that is becoming a whole nother problem because of some of the methods they use for chemical treatments are not working as well. There's the distribution. You can pretty much see that it's everywhere. I mean, since the 1940s, and it's gotten this far and in every system. So one of the things that's important, it interferes with recreation, swimming, navigation. And this plant has also been known to cause drownings. So it's definitely an issue to think about if you have kids that are out playing in the waterways. This thing clogs up and you can get injured quite easily. The other plant we're dealing with, flowering rush. There's a population in North Idaho and one in Eastern Idaho. Let's see. One problem with this plant is we're not able to figure out how to effectively manage it. The seeds are extremely viable and they drift in the waterways. A lot of canals have this issue, a lot of river systems, and mostly in the slower moving water it likes. Much of it, I think it's rooted about 9 feet down, so much of this plant is below the water line. So lots of the chemicals that you could use maybe wouldn't work because there's not enough vegetation that's above the water line to absorb it. Let's see. No, you can see the canalway and it's just completely out in the middle of the water, so that definitely impedes your flow.
It's actually a pretty little plant.
It is. Well, and you'll notice this about a lot of the invasives that are introduced. They're beautiful. That's how they got here. People thought it was a very pretty plant, and we'll see a couple more that you can completely see them in somebody's backyard pond, and that's exactly how they started. So you can see the root mass over there, that how thick it is. I mean, and they will put up little bulblets that will produce another plant, and then produce one right next to it, and then solid over, produce another one right next to it. So you could see in the soil, another plant wouldn't really be able to penetrate that whole system there. It's kind of hard to identify. It looks a lot like our native bulrush. It's got the triangular stems. The only time you can really identify it is when it's in bloom for a layperson, and that's going to be between, I think, June and July. And I guess the population Nick was telling me today in eastern Idaho hasn't been blooming. So it's very difficult for them, and I think that they've had to send it for genetic testing to make sure that that is.
Figure out why it won't. This genotype just won't bloom. I don't know if it's just due to environmental conditions or. You wouldn't think so, because the stuff in northern Idaho blooms and it does quite well, and the stuff that we have down in those ponds, we don't get a bloom. So definitely flowering rush though.
And this is just the map of flowering rush, so you can see up in northern Idaho where it started, and it just follows that water down. Eastern Idaho is the same thing, so it's definitely one that is being considered, but we're kind of open for suggestions a little bit on how to manage. So it's definitely one that, and I didn't touch on it. Some of our plants are on, we call it EDRR, Early Detection Rapid Response. And the whole idea with that is if you find a population and it's small enough, it's a lot easier to manage if it's a smaller size than when it gets large. So this one, and definitely I believe in eastern Idaho, is kind of, even though it's not on the EDR list, it's kind of being thought of as such because it is such a small population and not flowering yet. All right, here's my plant, Hydrilla. Now this plant was, you can actually still purchase this plant online in the aquarium trade. So it's bad, and I think our GIS specialist, his brother in Utah, had some in his aquarium, so definitely said, nope, that is not a good plant. This looks very similar to a native species called Elodea. What's the common name of Elodea?
Elodea.
Okay.
Yeah, Elodea condensis. Elodea metallia.
So the distinct difference between the two of them is the number of leaves, and so they both got the whorled effect. I call it the bottle brush effect. Hydrilla has 5 leaflet, 5 and up, and the Elodea is usually 3 and lower. Sometimes you find 4. They do grow in somewhat similar habitats, but Hydrilla is a plant that kind of tends to like warm waters. And this plant came from Asia and in warm water climates. So you're thinking, okay, why do we have it in Idaho? Well, you guys know that we've got geothermals everywhere. So in the areas where those geothermals mix in with the colder water, in some places it provides an environment that's perfect for these guys. Let's see, another distinguishing between Hydrilla and Elodea is there are, the leaf margins have a ribbing. It's kind of like a teeth-like. And Eladia does not have tubers, so tubers that they produce are kind of like potatoes. They're like their underground structure that stores all of their starch and stores all of their energy so they can keep popping up plants. When you remove a plant, at first they started using chemical, and then we've gotten the infestations down to a manageable size to where we can just go in and hand pull. And that's kind of what my crew and I do. And I think, there we go, there's a picture of a tuber. So it's very brittle. If you don't delicately remove it from the system, that tuber will pop off, and they think one tuber can produce about 200 tubers per square foot per year. And so each of those plants will pop up another shoot. This guy is also a notorious fragmenter. We only have the female variety, or the dioecious variety in Idaho. And so it's primarily vegetative reproduction. Tiny chunk of it drifts down. It can grow an inch a day, and I swear that this thing can grow an inch like an hour. We've walked past areas and gone like, where did this come from? I was just here. So very, very rapid growth. This is an area that we actually were there last week, and we only found 2 plants. This picture was taken in 2008, I believe. And this was identified by Tom Wolf. He was hunting, and was he hunting or duck hunting? And he was like, okay, this doesn't look right. There's 2 locations that we have this plant here in Idaho. One is in the Bruno River system, which feeds into CJ Strike, and the other is in a hot water ditch that's just right inside Boise. And that water kind of leaves out from Edwards greenhouse. So you can kind of maybe think that, okay, how did this plant get here? Okay, maybe it was an escapee. So pretty much this guy likes to stay in warmer climates. So you can see down, in the Gulf and in Florida, they have a huge problem with it. The only places that we have it are in those 2 that I just mentioned. And so it is an EDRR species to where we know it can cause a lot of harm. We know it's in a smaller region, so we're gonna attack that thing till it's gone. Yellow floating heart. There's a small population of this in Gem County, and Nick actually got to go last summer and pull a bunch of yellow floating heart. This one was also native to Eurasia. Let's see, they also have a tuber that they can overwinter, and then they spread by stolons, and they also do have seeds. It was a beautiful plant, so this one was definitely brought in as an ornamental, and along with the other plants, in what it does crowds out other vegetation. This is Lake Spokane, so this is, it fills up the entire waterway. You can't boat, you can't swim. I think fishing would be quite difficult, so definitely a nasty guy. Water hyacinth, this will be the last one I'll touch on. There was water hyacinth discovered in the Snake River, and it was coming, which dam was it? Salmon Falls Dam?
Lower Salmon Falls.
Lower Salmon Falls. The guy working there saw something that just didn't look quite right. And it was, where did they catch it? It was in the intake area?
Yeah, I
Or
think so.
so they made some calls, and Twin Falls, Cassia, Jefferson, Madison counties, and then the Idaho Fish and Game, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and ISDA responded. And so it basically was everybody getting in their boats and getting that plant out. Let's see what it looks like. It's beautiful. I mean, this plant, it's very waxy in appearance. It's got a bulbous petiole that when you cut it open, it kind of looks like styrofoam, and that allows it to float. It is a floating species, but it can also root down and produce seeds. But most of the reproduction is by daughter plants, and you can see the stolon that reaches across and produces another plant. And let's see the lower portion there. All of the plants in that waterway, they can increase their population size. They can double their size every 6 to 18 days. And so, yeah. But look at how pretty the flower is. No, and I think it was first discovered in the United States in the 1870s, and it was brought into a World's Fair type of a place. People had it in their ponds, and then when it overgrew, they didn't want it to die, so they're like, oh, let's go put it in the river, and it really took hold in some areas. It also likes warm weather, so when you see, I don't think I have a distribution map, no. When you see where it's growing, Florida again, Hawaii, all these areas, but because that area on the Snake River had a geothermal pond that